So much for listening to this episode of Earrings Off. We want to invite you to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. You can find us on Facebook at Earrings Off Podcast and on Instagram at The Earrings Off Podcast.
Welcome to Earrings Off. I'm Lou.
And I'm Teresa. Let's get started.
Hello, this is Teresa. In this episode, Lou and I chat with Dr. Almitra Berry, the ultimate equity warrior. Growing up in a low-wealth urban community, Dr. Berry witnessed educational disparities firsthand, sparking a lifelong passion for reform. For over 3 decades, she's been on the front lines transforming education for culturally and linguistically diverse learners in large urban school districts. After 16 years with a major educational publisher, she founded ALBerry Consulting, Inc., dedicated to achieving high academic outcomes through instructional equity. Dubbed an equity warrior by a superintendent, Dr. Berry's unique approach spans literacy, equity, diversity, and mindset shifts. Her mission? To challenge the status quo, inspire change, and ensure every child can excel academically. This is a good one, y'all. Enjoy.
Good morning. We have with us Dr. Almitra Berry, who's joined us here on Earrings Off. Welcome, Dr. Berry, to Earrings Off. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you all.
So we are looking forward to the conversation. We are admirers of your work, and we want to hear more about it. Can you share a transformative moment from your work in majority of color, low-wealth urban school districts? Talk to us a bit about that.
There are so many of them, but I think the big moment was a point where I sat in my classroom at the end of a school day. I was teaching 6th grade in a school that was 100% Title I. It was physically located right adjacent to a federal housing project. All my children were Black or brown. And I had applied to go there because I wanted to give back to my own community. And for at least a month, this was still the beginning of the school year, I cried every day after school because my kids were so low. Most of them, I think all of them, could not read at grade level. And I would call a friend of mine and she would pray with me over the phone. It's like, I got to keep going. I got to keep going. But then there was one day where it was like, you're supposed to be here. And there's more work for you here that has to be done. So you've got to straighten up, toughen up, get your stuff together and serve these children. And it was at that moment in time that I knew why I was teaching and what I needed to continue to do in my path to serving Black and brown children around the country.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Berry, how do you define instructional equity and why is it crucial for marginalized learners?
Sure. Well, I try to make a very simple definition of equity, and that is that every single child gets what it is that they need to be as successful as they can possibly be. And so for some children, they say, you give them a little extra. Well, the problem is that many of our children are starting a year, 2 years, 3 years behind, even at kindergarten. And if we don't catch them up to that point and then accelerate them, they are forever behind. So in terms of equity, it means that we're giving them more without taking away from any other child, but making sure that we're pouring enough resources into instruction for those children that they can be caught up, and then continuing to give them resources so that they can become scholars, scholar athletes, artists, whatever it is that they want to be, without all these excuses about, well, they come from, or well, their parents didn't, or their parents aren't contributing. I'll try and use my G-rated language today, but I say that's a bunch of malarkey.
Yeah.
Because if it was white children from a more affluent area that were struggling, they would give them everything they had to. Our children that are Black and brown, it doesn't happen. And the excuses that are given are always about where the kids come from or what their parents won't do. Well, their parents don't do because they're working 2 and 3 jobs. Their parents don't do because we didn't serve those parents when they were children in our schools. They don't know how to. But educators are the ones that are paid professionals that are trained to do the work and charged to do the work. So that's what we have to do as educators, is to make sure that gets done.
I would imagine it would take additional resources, right?
Yes.
How do you get the additional resources in a situation when I'm sure they're just not available? And I'm talking financial resources in particular.
Yeah. Well, school districts have extraordinarily large budgets. I know that there are budget cuts. I know that things are always tight as I look at data from state to state. For example, yesterday, a bill passed in North Carolina, and they were to provide vouchers, private school vouchers to children. Well, what happens in the wake of that, this just to frame the answer, is that private schools up their tuition because they knew they were going to get the additional voucher money from families who could already pay the $20,000 or $30,000 tuition for their children. But what happens to children in schools is that $5,000 voucher doesn't get them squat, so they can't use it. But that money, that $500,000 in funding, or $500 million, not $500,000, $500 million in funding is taken out of the public schools to give to affluent families to send their kids to the private schools, or basically to give them welfare to continue to send them to the private schools, and the private schools are making that much more money.
Wow.
You can do that as a state. Then you could instead pour the money into the public school system. A lot of folks don't know, and I'll give you just one example. It's a little dated, but just for a frame of reference, Houston Independent School District's annual budget was exactly the same as Continental Airlines.
Wow. Yeah.
As Sun Microsystems. So when a school district has the same amount of money coming in as a Fortune 500 company, there is money to be placed into instruction. We just have to have the political wherewithal to say, this is the part that needs to be done.
You have to have the political wherewithal, but you also have to have educators like you, because I don't care how much money you pour into a system. If you don't have people who are aware and who care and who are motivated to actually see differences as a plus and start there, you're going to continue to have children who struggle in those settings.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's about managing that budget.
Yes.
I mean, where are they putting the dollars? That's quite a huge budget.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Berry, can you explain your concept of culturally relevant pragmatism and its importance in education?
Yeah, big words. I always save those for the end of a workshop and say, okay, here's your big vocabulary. Basically, it's the idea that a child comes to school with a language and a culture and a way of learning. They already come to school with that. I don't care if it's preschool or kindergarten or high school. That's already been shaped in their lives. What we have to do as educators is recognize, value, and affirm what they come to school with, and then say, all right, that's what we're starting with. If this is how you learn, let me use that as a bridge to the learning that needs to happen in this classroom. If you are an auditory learner, if you learn by hearing things, you think about some of our children can hear music and they've got it, right? They've got the beat, they've got the lyrics, they've got it all. Then that is the bridge to get them to what you need them to learn. Many of our children are more kinesthetic. They need to do things with their hands. Then that's the bridge you use to teach them. But what you do not do, and one of my it's always been a passion, but one that I'm actually working on a new book for, is the language that children bring to school. Our Black children who speak African American English, brown children who speak Chicano English, our Jamaican children who come to school with patois, or Hawaiian children who speak Hawaiian Creole. Their language is language. And instead of using that and its phonetic system, its syntax, its rules, and understanding that there's even vocabulary that they have that you might not know and understand, especially if you are white, that you need to learn what that is and use that as a lever to make them bilingual or multilingual, instead of saying you need to learn to speak proper English, instead of demeaning them or denigrating, again, what it is that they come to school with.
Okay.
Yeah. What are some common misconceptions about culturally and linguistically diverse learners that you've encountered in your work?
I think I could write a whole book on those. Another whole book on those. Well, I just touched on one, and that is language, right? And that's a big one, because there's so much that is in our language. For instance, as an example, right now, we're all speaking what I call school English or academic English. But I'm just going to venture a guess that we could flip that and we could have a wonderful conversation in African American English. You're in one part of the country. I was born and raised in California. The language is the same across 50 states, Canada, and the Caribbean. African American English is a language, right? One of the biggest things that I run into is the expression, those kids, and I say that with little air quotes around me, those kids. And whether it's those Black kids or those Latino kids or those Southeast Asian kids or those Native American kids, when they say that about children of color, of children with diverse cultures, what they're saying is, like Kendrick says, they're not like us, right? But this is white people saying they're not right. And that is the biggest misconception that educators have, is that those children are coming to school without a language or without a culture or without a way of understanding or without a way of socialization. What they are coming to school with is a different culture than yours.
So true. And the thing about language, like you said, Doctor, we can easily flip in our language skills. But when you send a child a message that the beginning point is inferior. Mm-hmm. And children may not be as articulate as we are, but they have feelings and they understand and they feel when someone is trying to say to them, no matter the language, you're not there, you're inferior. And students start to shut down when that occurs in educational settings. I have seen it. And fought against it myself. So that's something certainly for all of us to be aware of. And it not only is offensive to a child, it's offensive when they see their parent treated that way or dismissed because of how they're communicating. So what you're describing is certainly critical. So what inspired your Affecting Change book series, and what key messages do you hope readers take away?
My biggest message is always culture, because there's a business saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Teachers love strategies. We love to give strategies on how to do this and how to do that, and how to make your classroom or your instruction or whatever. We give them strategies, but if you don't understand, if you don't have cultural competence, nothing else that you do matters. And so the framework that I set up in Affecting Change for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Learners is a framework that begins with cultural awareness and cultural competence. And after that has started to be developed to a certain point, we can look at instructional methods. We can look at curriculum choices. We can look at assessment. We can look at how we use data to make decisions. But if we don't have that cultural awareness piece in place, everything else is misinterpreted because you do not understand your children. And if you do not understand and can't connect to those kids, those 20, 30 faces, sometimes 40, that are staring back at you in a classroom, then all the other stuff will never truly resonate with them. The inspiration came from, actually, it wasn't inspiration. I wrote the first edition of Affecting Change after I was speaking at several conferences on the topic, that topic, particularly about language and language development in children of color. And I was approached by a publishing company, and they said they wanted to turn that into a book. And I said, yeah, whatever. And I kept going on about my business until they almost stalked me and asked me the same question at 3 different conferences. And I was like, okay, I guess this is serious, so I need to take a look at it. So that was really the big catalyst for saying, okay, I can keep talking at conferences, or I can turn this into a book that teachers can read everywhere and really forever, instead of reaching small audiences, reach much larger audiences. I wrote the second edition during COVID because what else were we going to do during COVID? It needed a brush up. A lot had changed. My book that's coming out this spring now will be through Corwin. Matter of fact, I just inked that deal yesterday. I'm really excited about that. And that is a book on effective classroom, equitable classroom strategies. And in that book, I go into looking at grading through a lens of equity. How do we set up our courses and our syllabi with equity first and foremost? Again, looking at our classrooms and going deeper into, for instance, if I'm a teacher, let's say I'm 80%, 87, up to 87% of teachers are white women. So I always frame this with the vast majority of teachers are white women, especially in the elementary schools. So if you are a white woman who is teaching a classroom of children of color, what do you need to do? And how can you, and this is where I give them strategies, how you can start to become more culturally connected to the kids in the classroom that you teach in. Right. So these are the things that you can do. These are the understandings you need to have. This is where you can go to get information and instruction and become more immersed in that culture so that you can work in that community with a greater level of effectiveness. But really putting that lens of equity first and foremost through everything that you do in your classroom.
Wow.
Yeah, that's really nice. Congratulations on the new book. What advice would you give to educators and leaders who want to become equity warriors in their own communities?
Sure. Well, of course, a little shameless self-promotion, read my books, right?
Yeah.
Not shameless. Not shameless? Okay. Well, no shame in my game. Start with the books. Connect with me on social. I am putting out tidbits. I do have a podcast, as you know. And so for every week, every episode that I do, there are probably 6 to 8 little snippets of information that are out across all social media channels. I do book study via Patreon. So it's not like I have to push into your school or district. You can do this independently. But the biggest thing that you have to do as an educator is have a little bit of cognitive humility. And that is understanding that your way of believing is okay, but it is not the only way. And it may not be the right way for the community that you are paid to serve. So when you have that cognitive humility, it means that it's sort of okay, let me take a step back and let me look at things through a different lens. And let me start to understand the lens that I need to have to serve the children I have. So the biggest thing is just saying, we can be very egotistical people. And often the higher up the food chain you are, the bigger your ego. So taking a step back and saying, I still can learn. And let me go about learning to be more culturally competent and culturally aware and take that first step. And then where I begin in the upcoming book is really with digging into your own implicit biases and understanding what those things are and where they come from and how they infect your practice and the things that you say to children, even the way that you look at children, where that comes from and the damage it can do, even when you either aren't saying anything or you're saying something that you believe is so innocent, such as, I don't see color, which is malarkey. right? Yeah. And I say, if you don't see color, then you don't see me. You don't see the children in your classrooms because you are refusing to see who they are. Yeah. And then doing what needs to be done to serve them.
Well, Dr. Berry, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise with our hearings audience. Those are all of our questions. Do you have any parting information you can share with our audience? Again, being sure to let them know how to get in touch with you.
Sure. Well, I always say my daddy made it really easy to find me when he gave me this name. So I am at Almitra Berry across every social media platform except for X, Twitter. It is my X. I don't go on there. It is, for me, it was not a healthy environment because of the threats and all the other stuff. But Threads, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, if you search for Almitra Berry, you will find me. From there, website links, links to the book, all of that are there. And Patreon is the 3E podcast. The podcast itself is the Educational Equity Emancipation Podcast, if you're looking for that. And in every episode, there is a little in the notes, there is a link where you can text me directly. So easy to find me.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us here at Earrings Off. Take good care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.